Now we welcome in longtime writer and senior executive at NHL.com, co-host with myself of the great podcast Metal Misconduct, which we'll get into in a little bit. My good friend Shawn Roarke, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Brian. Getting ready for a big storm here. How are you?
Oh yeah, I'm not getting ready for a storm, but many of my friends are. So this is why I live on the West Coast. We don't have to deal with that sort of stuff. But I am excited today because we get to talk about a track that absolutely deserves to be in the 100 songs that define heavy metal. We're going to argue whether this is the original speed metal song or not, which we'll talk about too. But it accepts incredible song, "Fast as a Shark." Where did you first encounter this one?
Well, I was a teenager, 14, 15 years old, growing up in Rhode Island, and there's a radio station there called WHJY that was like the local heavy metal station, and they had on I think it was called the Power Hour maybe, and it was a midnight show, and it showcased heavier metal. They played, all the basics during the day, but this night show was from midnight to 1 or 2 in the morning, and they went a little more extreme. And that's the first place I remember hearing that, kind of curled up in bed with the transistor radio, and just being like, oh my God, what is this? Especially because it was of such poor quality. The very beginning of that song, as you know, it sounds like a transistor radio, so it was like double. I was completely flummoxed, and then of course it starts into what we all know as the song, and I was like, oh my God, my head was completely blown off.
Yeah, I was the first time I ever went to England, I was in northern England. A friend of mine who I was a pen pal with he was a teacher at a boys' school, and it was summertime, so there was nobody at the school, so he let us stay in the whatever they call it was like school, but they also had bedrooms and stuff there. So he let me stay there as my friend John and I think I'd gone to the bathroom or something down the hallway, and I come walking down the hallway and I hear that Heidi. I'm like, what is this? And then it screeches, and then the guitar comes on. And then I'm like, oh my God. It's like ran to the room, like, what are you guys playing? So it's the new Accept album. I was like, this is the same thing. It blew my mind, especially, this is 1982, where you didn't hear stuff like that, that heavy at that time. So I was just, we're both, the whole record's incredible, but that song in particular was like, what is happening here? Just so fast, so heavy. It's so incredible.
Had you heard any of the earlier stuff? Because that was literally the first Accept I had ever heard.
Yeah, they had a record out before that, and when I worked at the record store, they were one of the bands. I think they had two records before that. So yeah, I had heard them, and I liked them. I sold some of the records at the store as well, but I did not expect what we got on that record, especially the beginning song. It's like whoa, this is just, incredible. It's so incredible. Of course, it was a whole firestorm of a record that became huge, and I sold. Gosh, I want to say we sold probably 250 copies at least at my store, because that, anybody came in, it's like, if you haven't heard this, you have to listen to this record.
Yeah, no, and it was just, it was so different, and they never really touched it again. Like they were a band that was really like, kind of into regular heavy metal, like a lot of Scorpions, a lot of um, AC/DC in their sound, and bands like that. And those were the bands they emulated, and they went so far afield with that song, and they never really played with it again. They kind of went back to their roots. They became that big Teutonic power metal band that was a template for so many others.
Yeah, they got, because the first couple of records did okay, but they weren't really super popular. Still pretty much on independent labels in Europe, and eventually they did get a major deal in the U.S. In fact, the record didn't come out in the U.S. until I think several months after it come out in Europe. It didn't come out until '83 actually, and the record came out in '82 in Europe. But I think that because they were kind of an independent band, it was the first few records, they were kind of just like, let's just do something fun. And even when you talk to Wolf Hoffman about it, he's kind of like, yeah, it's just another record, and we were just kind of playing around with some different things, and it wasn't like this landmark record that we all know it was. And then then they were on a major label after that, and we know what happens to so many bands in the 80s when they got on the major labels is they are not as heavy anymore.
Yeah, and no, and that, I mean, that was definitely true, because then it went from there. It went to, Balls to the Walls, which was their big commercial hit, and that album was good. And for me, Metal Heart was my favorite album they ever did. Like,
Really?
I love Fast as a Shark, but I love Metal Heart, and it is commercial. But just from front to back, I thought that album was great. And that was the first time, I think that tour was the first time I saw them. I saw them at a place called Rocky Point Amusement Park in Rhode Island. It's gone now. The husk of it is still there, and it's like a walking trail. But it was the place to be. And on Friday and Saturday nights in the summers, they would do concerts. I saw Corey Hart there. He played his Sunglasses song 3 times to get through the whole set. Like, he didn't have much else there. But Accept played, and we went, and it was a Friday or Saturday night, and got right up towards the front, and seeing Udo Dirkschneider, their lead singer, was a revelation. Like, such a small but powerful man, and to me, he has one of the most distinctive and enjoyable voices in all of metal.
Yeah, amazing singer, and he definitely did not look. He looked different than all the other singers, which is kind of unique as well. Uh, but yeah, an incredible vocalist. And the weird thing too about Accept is, quick story. You mentioned Metal Heart, so quick Metal Heart story. So my good buddy Chris Jericho, I was hanging out with him at his house in Tampa once, and he had a couple of his other metal friends who were going to come over, and we're all going to hang out. And he said, one of my friend has a metal heart, and I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, a metal heart. He has the metal heart. I'm like, what are you talking about? So he was like playing around with me, but he had the actual artwork, the piece of art that they made the album cover from. So he told me the story how he acquired it. I forget it, but I don't know how some guy in Tampa, Florida has the metal heart, but he has it nonetheless. But yeah, but back to this record. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and look, they work with the great Dieter Dierks, and that has I'm sure they sound good, but I'm sure that had a lot to do with the sound. And that was the other thing that I loved about this record. It was so raw. It was like super heavy and raw, and it just felt and sounded like an underground independent record, even though it kind of wasn't necessarily.
Yeah, first of all, like, their back end, like drumming, their drummer and their bass, to me, drives the whole thing, right? Like, I just think that's fantastic. I think, Kaufman is a fantastic drummer, and it's unfortunate, what happened, that he couldn't play later on after getting injured. But to me, that kind of drives that whole album, and drives their whole sound, really. So, like, they were much more polished after that, obviously, as they went forward, and it became this big, expansive sound. But they kind of sounded like almost like a barroom band.
Yeah, 100%. And then, seeing them live, the first time I saw them live was after this record come out in the States. And they did that initial tour. They played, I'm trying to remember what they played, a club, and I don't even think that club exists anymore in LA, but they were insane. Like the whole crowd was insane. The band was really on fire. It was one of the better shows I've ever seen. But yeah, they kind of had that bar band thing with that record, but every song was good too. But of course, this one was the one that, again, a lot of people. So we've kind of talked about all these songs on this podcast, and we've talked about Priest, and the other songs that we think are speed metal, even all the way back to Deep Purple doing Speed King, which a
Yeah.
lot of people point to as it's kind of the embryonic cell portion of speed metal. But this was, I think, the one that really set it off, because this came out again in the 80s, and even though they weren't English, it was kind of came out during the new wave of British heavy metal, and a lot of those bands started to do that. And then shortly thereafter, you get the Metallicas and the Slayers, and all of us were such humongous fans of this record and this song.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, because I know obviously your connection to Metallica and that whole, genre that came out of that area with your label and just bands you knew. Like, was this an influence for them?
Oh, a million percent. I mean, this record was. I just remember, even before I knew that there were bands in LA or anywhere else, that this record was a firestorm record when it came out, and so I had so many musicians that would come to the store and buy stuff. And I mean, absolutely every single person in whether it's Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax, Exodus, all of those, thrash metal bands that started had it. This was a massive influence on them, and specifically the song, because a lot of them are a couple of years younger than I am even, and I think this was really the first kind of fast song they heard. I don't know if they all had heard, Priest at that point, but if they'd heard Excited by Priest, which is kind of the beginning point too. But this was the one that really did it. And yeah, 100%. If you ask any of those guys where a lot of their influences came from, especially starting out, they'll mention the newer British heavy metal, a lot of stuff. But this record in particular, because this was just a little, I guess it was during the same time, but I don't recall any of those bands in England, even Maiden, having anything this fast quite yet. Like Maiden got to it more, I think, on Killers when that record came out. It was a faster record, but yeah, this was kind of like I said, the real flashpoint of the whole thing. And even the band kind of say, a lot of people say this, and we'll take credit for it. Sure, why not?
Yeah, but they didn't really know it at the time, right? And the part that strikes me is because everything I was listening to at that point, like even the heavy stuff, like the drums, they were just kind of there along for the ride for the most part. And in this one, like especially in the beginning, the double bass is just so wild, right? It's like a galloping horse, and I can't imagine there were a ton of bands that had drummers that could play that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you go back to Priest. I mean, they were able to do Exciter because they had Les Binks, who was this incredible drummer, and it wasn't that easy to do double kicks and those sort of things back in the day. And you're right, like he's an amazing drummer, and again, you have to these fast songs. Any of these bands, all the thrash metal bands. I mean, look at all the drummers for all those bands. They're all incredible musicians, and you have to be, because that's what's driving the fast stuff. If you have to have that drum, so if you don't have a drummer that can play fast and play that double kick style sound, it's not going to work.
And I guess that was the tutorial, right?
100%.
There must have been a ton of kids just banging away. I know you've told the story numerous times about Lars and his apartment and with the half-built drum set and stuff like that. But upon hearing this, there had to be a ton of guys that just locked themselves in a garage and tried to go as fast as they could. And I'm sure there were some failures and some successes.
Yeah, 100%. And it was Lars's house, was his dad's house. What the unkempt drum set was, but yeah, it was pretty crazy. And I just remember again when it came out that all of a sudden there was this huge wave within the scene, because at that point I had put out the fanzine and had the record store, so I was kind of there. We found there were other people around the country that were into things, and this was. I remember we're all pen paling and doing various things, and this was kind of the record where everybody's like. It was kind of the record of the moment when it came out, because it was so different and unique and kind of from left field. Some German heavy metal band does this groundbreaking heavy metal record. It's kind of, you wouldn't expect it, especially if you listen to the first two Accept records, which are really good. And, Breaker has a couple of faster songs too, but this was the one where they definitely made it work. And the fact that it's the first song on the record, and the whole like little intro, that makes it even better.
Yeah, like that to me, like that whole dissonance is unbelievable. And when I saw them, like I said, Rocky Point was like something that bands did like while they're on tour. It was just a stop they could do in the summer. It was almost like a shed, an amphitheater, but it didn't have that shape, right? And the sound wasn't that great. And to me, it was a band like that I had listened to, and it was just mine, right? Like there was nobody where I went to school that was into it. Like it wasn't. I was kind of on the outside as far as music went. Like there were some kids that listened to rock, but they didn't really go that far, right? And I had only seen a couple of live shows at that point. I saw, the first show I ever saw was Billy Squier in Nazareth at the Providence Civic Center.
That's not bad.
No, it was a great show, and to me, to this day, I love Billy Squier. I think he's so underrated as a guitarist and as a musician. But
agreed.
I had only seen one or two other shows, and then I saw this show, and there were so many people there, and it's the first time I had ever seen a show without seats.
Oh,
right?
Wow, yeah.
So there's that energy of in a normal concert, like you get up and you're like, yeah, whatever. And you hold your lighter up and whatever else. But this was like, there wasn't moshing per se, but it was that whole transfer of energy that went on, as you heard songs that were on the radio and everybody got excited. And it was one of the first times you really felt like that sense of community, and you were like, wow, there's a lot of people who like the stuff that I like.
Yeah, and so you're a hockey guy. You obviously that's your gig. You've written for NHL.com and worked in the hockey world for a long time. Where and how did the metal whole thing come in for you?
I think it was, it just really attracted me, the kind of community part of it. Like I said, that the outsider part of it, like I played hockey my whole life, and I was a goalie. So that should tell you a little something about being an outsider and being a little strange. I love the power of it and the sound of it and you know the violence almost and then when I started going to shows and I started going to the local the local record store and started, meeting people that were more like me, it kind of opened those doors. And since then, I left home at 18. I went to college in Syracuse, and then I moved to Jersey and I worked in a newspaper and I worked for Fox Sports before I got to the NHL. It's always been kind of my entry into conversations and finding people very much like me. Yesterday I went to WSOU, which you know very well here in Jersey. It's launched hundreds of bands. I actually went back and spoke to their journalism class or their journalism kids about what they're facing and where they're going to go. And I told a
Cool.
lot of these stories about how, for me, especially when I moved to Jersey and I knew nobody, like SOU was my soundtrack. I would hear the ads for the shows, and I'd be like, I'm going to go see that show. And a lot of times it was by myself because the people I worked with weren't into it or whatever. And I'd go into New York, I'd go into Trenton, I'd go to all these places and see shows, L'Amour's, whatever it was, and that's where I started to kind of find my community. So for me, that's kind of what it was. And it's just exotic. You know something that other people don't know, and they might look down their nose on it, but who cares?
Yeah, and SOU is a legendary station in New Jersey that is reached all over the tri-state area. And they've been playing metal forever, and they had a massive influence because if it wasn't for them, a lot of people like yourself included wouldn't have the access to this stuff. So we love them, and we've done stuff with them, tons of times over the years. And yeah, super important station for sure. Um, yeah, it's interesting because the whole hockey thing. To me, like, it's why is that my favorite sport and why is metal my favorite music? Because they're both fast, aggressive. There's skill involved. It's very similar, so I like the way it goes hand in hand, which I think is a reason why there's mostly metal being played at the games live. If you go to any NHL game or minor league game for that matter, they're probably 75% of all the music that they're playing during the game, during the timeouts, is always metal.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we've talked about this numerous times, and one of the first games I ever went to when I started at the NHL is as I went to Pittsburgh for Mario Lemieux's return from cancer at the old Igloo, and they came onto the ice for warm-ups to Raining Blood
Yeah.
from Slayer, and I almost lost my mind. It's to this day, and I've covered hockey for 30 years. I started in 94 with the Devils and the Rangers, so I'm at 33 years now. To this day, it is one of the coolest things that has ever happened in an ice rink. I can still remember where I sat and when the song started, and I just started looking around at people, and I was like, there's no way. There's no way they're doing this.
Yeah, and they used to drop the puck to that when the big games began too at the Igloo. They had to, because we both know the DJ over there. He's a huge metalhead, great dude. But they used to drop the puck to that at the old Igloo. But when they moved to the new, more corporate building, they had to tame it down. But they still drop the puck to Seek and Destroy by Metallica. So it's still old school metal, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it is. It for me. It's really the soundtrack, and every year when the playoffs start, I always pick a song, right? That's going to be like my playoff song because sometimes, especially when I was younger, I was on the road for 40 out of 45 days. Living like a rock star, basically going from city to city and covering games, and then getting on a plane and going somewhere else. And every year at the start of the playoffs, especially once like social media became something, I would tweet, hey, this is my song this year, whether it was Underground by Life of Agony or whatever it might be. And like that was my soundtrack for a whole playoff. And now, I can hear some of those songs and still remember what playoff it was from. And it takes me right back to those times. Like a perfect example is when Peter Steele died. I was driving from Boston to Ottawa. I did 8 playoff games in 8 days by car.
Oh,
It was
ouch.
all on the East Coast: Buffalo, Pittsburgh, DC, Ottawa, Boston, Montreal, like the whole thing. I thought it was a great idea until about day 6. And then I couldn't even get into a car.
Yeah.
The drive home from Montreal back to New Jersey was one of the most painful things I've ever done. But it was on the road from Boston to Ottawa. I was listening to Sirius Liquid Metal, and they came on, and they were basically like, Peter Steele has passed. And like I pulled over, and I sat in the rest area for well over an hour, just processing it and thinking about how influential that band had been to me, and all of those things. So it both accentuates the sport and it kind of transcends it, right?
100%. Well, and so I've talked about this before on here, but this is not my first podcast. The first podcast I did was with you, called Metal Misconduct, which still lives on iTunes if you want to go check it out. We did quite a few of them. But I remember you came to me with the idea, said, hey, why don't we do a podcast where we talk to athletes, mostly hockey players, about their love of metal? Because back then there were a lot more than they were now. And I'll never forget, I said, well, I don't know how we can do that, because hockey players and athletes in general don't have much personality. You listen to them in interviews, and it's very, short, scripted answers, basically. So he said, no, I think if we talk hockey about them, they'll be into it. I'm like, all right, well, let's give it a shot. And the first guy we had on was Drew Stafford, Buffalo Sabre, and played with a few other teams. And I knew him because he was good friends with Ken Susi from Unearth at the time, and I talked to him a few times. So I knew he was a legit metalhead. I think he actually knew more bands and more about it than I did. But
he did.
we did that first podcast, and I was again kind of worried, like, okay, how is this going to go? Are we going to get more than 15 minutes out of this guy? We think like talked for like an hour. And I remember you were pretty shocked because, again, like, that guy rarely does interviews, and when he does, they're really boring. But I think, what is it? Didn't you ask him afterwards, like you barely give me 5 minutes, and all of a sudden you're talking an hour? What's the deal?
Yeah, no, I did. I said, I can barely get an answer out of you, and here you are holding court for over an hour. And he said, well, you never asked me the questions about things I want to talk about. And I, it's funny because I said that last night when I was at SOU to the kids. I'm like, sometimes you have to find a new way in. Another perfect example is you took me to the Whitechapel show, and we did that interview backstage with the guys from Whitechapel, and the singer told you afterwards, he was like, that's the best interview I did. I never asked him about the band. I never asked him about the new album, right? I asked him about all his sportdom, and it wasn't usable because the band was bleeding in that was playing at the time, and the air conditioner was right over our head. But it was a great interview, and he enjoyed it because it was so out in left field. I wasn't asking, for where this song came from, like, what was your process for this or anything like that. I'm like, what do you think about the Tennessee Titans and all of those things? So that was a huge part of the success, I think, of our podcast. And we did, like, I could still remember we had Kyle Turley on, and he was so good at talking about music, right? He talked a little about football, or Randy Johnson, the same thing. He talked about photography and music. We didn't talk to him about baseball at all.
No.
And I think for some of the listeners, it was kind of out in left field too, right? Because they're like, oh, Randy Johnson's going to be on. They're going to talk about, all the strikeouts and him hitting the bird and all these other things. And there wasn't even a question about it. And, he had a legendary persona of not being media friendly. And he couldn't have been a nicer human being.
Oh, no, he's such a great guy. And, same thing. I had, seen all the takes, he was in New York yelling at the press and everything, but I knew he was a metalhead because the people from Q Prime at one point asked me when he was playing for the Yankees, because he was a huge fan of this band Trouble that we had on our label. And I guess he had lost his albums or didn't have them. And so they said, hey, can you send us the first 3 Trouble records? I'm like, yeah, of course. Cause they were going to Randy Johnson. So when I met him first after he had gotten out, he was a photographer. Like, he could not have been a nicer guy. Hung out with him, been to dinner with him many times. Just a really good guy. And it's funny about that because just recently, I'm a huge fan of Jim Rome. I've been listening since he basically first started, and I've been interacting a little bit more with the show just because you can on X, you can tap in your responses and they read it on the air, and somehow he knows who I am, and I become like a little bit a piece of the show, which is interesting. But he was going on about Randy Johnson because, like, I think most sports guys, they're like, he comes across as like a badass and has a bad attitude and all this stuff, and they're saying stuff like that about him, and I just wrote in and said, hey Jim, I know Randy, I've hung out with him a million times. He's one of the best dudes ever. He's awesome, but the press is going to say something different. So it's always interesting. And on that same note about hockey players or athletes talking about music and being really into it, you guys at NHL and you yourself were very kind enough to let me interview some players a couple of years ago at the NHL media day before the season, and I got to talk to Jack Eichel, and it was only like 15 minutes, but all we did was talk music. And it was great because he's totally into it. And at the end of the interview, I'll never forget, he's like, this is the most fun I've had in a long time in an interview. So I was like, oh, that was awesome, man.
Well, anytime anybody talks to you, it's the most fun they've had
I don't
in
know
a
about
long
that.
time. Like, I learn something new every time we go to dinner or we hang out. It's fantastic. But yeah, no, I really encourage people to go back and listen to some of those Metal Misconducts. They were fantastic. I still remember the one where we had Richard Christie and Johan Hegg, and I took you guys. We were at the
we had a show,
Megadeth show at the
Yeah.
at the Meadowlands, and I took you guys because everybody had backstage passes to like the room where we do our work. That was on the whole other side of the building. That's the only place we could find that was quiet, and we did the podcast in the workroom for the media when the Devils games are going on.
That's funny because Richard is not allowed to do any podcasts any longer because he's with Stern, and I get it. I mean, you've had the same thing. Like, they want all your work to be with them, but I forgot about that. Richard Christie. I was like, oh, he actually did. I guess that was so early in his career with Stern that they just didn't care. Okay, who cares? You can do whatever you want.
Or Johan was going to threaten Howard.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's that too. He's a big menacing Viking for sure. Yeah, it's craziness, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. If you guys want to check that out, like I said, it's still up on iTunes. Just put it Metal Misconduct and it'll come up, and there's a lot of really good interviews in there, especially if you're a sports fan. But anyway, back to Accept, Restless and Wild. And again, it just the more I hadn't listened to this record or the song for a minute, so I was like to listen up before I come in and do some research. And yeah, man, it's still we talk a lot about, especially on this podcast, because a lot of the stuff we talk about here is like 70s and 80s stuff. And the reason why that is to me, that's the core of what metal is and what's become. And these, songs are the songs that do define heavy metal more so than, some of the newer stuff, just because newer stuff is newer. And this record still, man, to this day, whatever it's 40 some odd years in, it still sounds so good. It still sounds so fresh. And a lot of times things get dated when you listen to them much later and you go, well, I really liked it when it came out. Now it's still good, but it doesn't have that same that same sort of edge and energy to it. But this one still does for me.
Dude, this, especially Fast as a Shark, is a song like if you're driving and you hear it on like Sirius, you're gonna get pulled over. Because I just start going like 20 miles an hour faster than I was going a minute earlier. Right.
And it's still a fast song. Like, you look at all this fast stuff that's come out, and well, there's no blast beats on it. It's still really fast.
Yeah. And it's kind of lost, right? Kind of in the middle of like, again, if you think of Sirius, like it's not going to be on Ozzy's Boneyard that much because it's not as mainstream, but it's also, it doesn't really fall into liquid metal as much. Once in a while you hear it, but it's kind of somewhere in the middle. It hasn't really found a home. It's found a home with everybody that's ever listened to it, but commercially, I don't think it's ever really found its niche. And the other thing that amazes me, like one of the things I really love about that song, and we talk so much about the music and the speed and everything, the lyrics are fantastic, right?
Yes.
It's just, it's the trope of the boogeyman hiding in the shadows, getting ready to take your life.
Which is also kind of interesting because the first album that I forget what her name was, but anyway, she got credited for a lot of the lyrics because again, Germany, same thing with Scorpions. The mid '70s, early '80s. There were not a lot of people in Germany that spoke English. It wasn't taught in schools. Like these guys had to go learn it. So it was interesting that people from Germany could, not only have these great songs and a lot of the, some of the lyrics were different and whatever. But for this song specifically, yeah, you're right. They completely nailed it.
Yeah, and other bands didn't even try, right? Like when you think about the '80s into the '90s, right? Like I loved, uh, you know, like Rammstein and KMFDM went kind of back and forth, but for except this was their primary language.
And I will say, I'm just looking at Spotify really quickly, and next to, whoops, didn't want that to happen. A little music in the background here. Whoops. But it's the second most streamed song next to Balls to the Wall. So there is something to be said for history. I guess it's the second most popular accept song, at least on streaming on Spotify. So that's kind of interesting.
Cream always rises to the top, Brian.
Right, you're exactly right on that for sure. And yeah, what a tremendous song is. And again, I can't underestimate how important this song was to all the bands that came after them. And as we talked about earlier, like all of them credit this song as being a massive influence. And I think because this came out like I said, this came out in the early '80s when these bands were first forming. I think it had even more of an influence on them because hey, here's another band playing stuff really fast. We want to do the same thing, and we think we can be just as fast, if not faster. So it kind of became, in a weird way, a competition between especially those early thrash bands, like who could play faster. I remember both Slayer and Metallica would ask me, like, how fast is the new Slayer stuff? And the Slayer guys, how fast is the new Metallica stuff? So it was a whole competition back then. And I think, this song certainly kicked it off for sure.
Yeah, and like you think sometimes like the truly great bands, they have trees, right? It's like the NFL. The NFL has coaching trees, and there's some coaches that are so innovative and so important that they have these huge trees, and then there's other coaches who are really good and they don't really have a tree, right? Because they're their own thing. Like, and to me, it's the same thing with bands. And when you think about Accept's tree, like it is ginormous. It's like a weeping willow, right? First of all, you got all those German bands, Creator and all those bands that are direct descendants of them, Sodom, all those, and then Exodus and back here and all these other bands, all the bands that have covered this song, right, as a tribute. Like they're in the NHL, it's a trade tree, right? Wayne Gretzky gets traded and you track it all the way through history, almost to today with the draft picks and everything else. Like we're almost 40 years in and you can still pick bands and be like, okay, well, they're a descendant of this band and this band, but it goes all the way back to Accept. They're like one of the core bands, right? That everybody's kind of evolved from.
Yep, 100%.
They're one of the tribes. They're one of the original tribes.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And on that great point, we're going to end it. But dude, thank you so much for doing this. Always fun talking to you and reliving our old podcast days again. So thanks again, man. Appreciate it.
Brian, I told you when you asked me to do this, it was going to be the most exciting thing I did this month. And it is only because the month ends and then I leave next week to go to the Olympics. And that's going to be pretty exciting too. But for this month, it's right up there.
Good. Well, yeah, Milan will be a lot of fun. So you can't leave yet, though, because we got to upload it. So you have to stay on for a couple minutes.